Okay, I'm gonna test the speakers. We've got about a minute to go before 9:30, so I'm gonna see if this will work.
Good morning.
Come on. Audio.
Actually.
All right, somebody say something.
Hello.
Okay, we got it. It's working. It's picking it up. People have a tendency to change the speaker or the microphone out in here. I'm not sure why. So today we need to talk about actual theory and some challenges to theory. And I put this up here the last time I talked about the fact that philosophy answers three great questions, and those questions are relevant to all people in all places at all times, and certainly relevant to all academic disciplines. So students often ask, why should we study philosophy when we're talking about marketing? And it's because philosophy deals with these three questions: the question of knowledge, the question of conduct, and the question of governance. And of course, the question of knowledge is a big one for philosophical inquiry, and I suggested to you that the PhD is the highest degree that we award at a college level. And if you get a PhD in marketing, it's why is it called the PhD? Well, because you're contributing to the body of knowledge, right? You're contributing to the body of knowledge. And so we face these questions of how is it I can know what I know? What is it I can know? And so we have various subfields of philosophy that impact and are relevant to all academic disciplines. So with regard to the question of knowledge, there are two subfields that are relevant here. One is epistemology, which is the study of knowledge. What is it I can know? How can I know it? And then metaphysics, which is the study of reality. How do we know that what we're experiencing is real? How do we know that I exist, you exist, that we're not some figment of the imagination of some superior being, right? So these are important questions. There are some challenges to these. You can answer these questions using something other than philosophy, but if you use something other than philosophy to answer these questions, you get really interesting results. So how can you answer these questions using something other than philosophy? Well, you can answer these questions using the question of knowledge, the question of conduct, and the question of governance. You can answer these questions, trying to get this to come up, using a mythology. And I realize this is clunky. If I launch the presentation, it goes into playing the narrated PowerPoint. And as many times as I've tried to stop it from playing the narrated PowerPoint, it just plays the narrated PowerPoint. So I apologize. I realize this is clunky. I've attempted to undo the narrated PowerPoint, and for some reason, it will not save without the narrated PowerPoint. So I realize this is kind of clunky, but we're just gonna have to go with it until I figure out how to put these slides back into something that's not necessarily a narrated PowerPoint. So you can answer these questions, the question of knowledge, the question of conduct, the question of governance, using a mythology. What is a mythology? How many of you watch Netflix? Anybody like Netflix? Almost everybody watches Netflix, right? There's a new show on Netflix called Chaos. Have any of you heard of this or seen it on Netflix? Stars Jeff Goldblum. He plays Zeus, the head or the king of the Greek pantheon of gods. And it's kind of an interesting show. So you can use these using a mythology, right? So the Greek mythology, they have these pantheons of gods. Basically, a mythology is kind of a dead religion. You can answer these questions using religion, the question of knowledge, the question of conduct, the question of governance, or you can use philosophy. Now, what's wrong with using mythology? Well, obviously, we don't believe that there's this Greek pantheon of gods anymore. What's wrong with using religion? Well, whose religion are we going to use if we answer these questions? And how are we going to determine what we should be doing? Even within the same religion, if we think about, for example, the fact that the United States is largely a Judeo-Christian nation, which version of the book are we going to use? The Catholic Bible is different than the Protestant Bible, right? There's the King James Version of the Bible. There's the New International Version of the Bible. The New International Version is, it's an attempt to sort of bring biblical language into modern day vernacular, right? That's an interpretation. There are interpretation problems with that. And so how are we going to answer that? So you end up with these interesting results if you use these other forms, or you can use philosophy, which is a rational analysis of alternatives and how we can know what we know. How is it that we can judge what is good and bad conduct using some more objective standard, right? So I think that there are proofs in ethics that we can offer, although they're not necessarily as concrete as the mathematical proofs that we have for things like the Pythagorean theorem. There are these challenges to philosophical ethics, and these seem, for the most part, with the exception of this one, the first two seem right. They seem intuitively like they are correct. The first challenge to philosophical ethics and what it is we can know, this is a challenge to both of these prongs, the question of knowledge and the question of conduct, is called subjectivism. So subjectivism says that ethics is really up to the individual. We can't ever really have an objective reality with regard to ethics because it doesn't lend itself to sort of the proofs that we have with regard to, by the way, I'm holding my phone because there are a bunch of your classmates that have gotten something. One texted me and said that they had COVID. So I said that they could participate in class today by texting me. So I'm not being rude and trying to ignore you. I am trying to monitor my text message stream in case anybody in the YouTube channel world is watching and wants to participate in the class discussion. So subjectivism says, look, there are not proofs like a squared plus b squared equals c squared in ethics. It's really just my feelings. This is based on what's called the philosophical idea of solipsism. Solipsism is the philosophical belief, it's the philosophical equivalent of narcissism. Narcissism is a sort of psychological construct. It's based on a mythology. There's a youth who looks into a reflecting pool and falls in love. Narcissus falls in love with his own image. Solipsism says, it's the philosophical equivalent, says that the self is all we can really know. We talk about, and in marketing, this is a huge concept, empathy. One of the things that we know, for example, in professional selling is that people who exhibit high levels of empathy often do well in the field of professional sales because clients, customers, constituents trust them. They feel like they can relate to them. And they feel like they understand their issues and problems, right? And provide solutions. That can be a very powerful tool to use. You can use that for good or bad, right? We could also manipulate people. If you exhibit high levels of empathy, but you're really kind of sociopathic, you could use that for evil, right? So the self is all one can know. Can we ever really have empathy? Do we ever really know what it is to be somebody else? Can you really walk in somebody else's shoes? It's really, really difficult. Now, there are ways that we can measure this, and it's becoming more and more objective. One of the things that we know is, for example, people who lack empathy don't exhibit what's called yawn contagion. So if you see someone yawning, you have a tendency to yawn too. That's an indication of empathy. Sociopaths don't, generally, as I understand it, right? So we see evidence of this kind of objective reality that we can, in fact, maybe exhibit empathy, although it is impossible to totally understand what somebody else is feeling. But within the range of human experience, we can get close. So subjectivism says, like, all I can know is myself. Ethics is really hard. There's no real proofs in ethics. And so it's really up to the individual. Now, what can we say with regard to this? Well, if we accepted subjectivism as true, what we would find is that there are no sort of universally accepted norms and principles that have applied at all places, at all peoples, at all times. And we can, in fact, find those. We can find three. And if we can find three, we can find others. And if we can find three, we can dispense with this idea that there is no objective proof in ethics, right? So what are the three that we can find in all societies, in all places, at all times? If we look at the anthropological and archaeological record, we know that no society could be formed if you allowed for the indiscriminate killing of members of the in-group. So that's the first one that we can find. No society on the face of the earth has ever allowed for the indiscriminate killing of members of the in-group. We generally call this a prohibition against murder of members of the in-group. Now, it may be acceptable, particularly among some primitive societies, to murder people of the out-group. In the United States and North America and Central America and South America, there were various cultures that popped up at various times and created great empires. And you all have probably studied these if you've taken things like humanities, which you should have taken already, depending on which course in humanities, and you probably studied it in high school and stuff like that. You know that there were these tribes, you know, in Mexico called the Aztecs, and in South America called the Incas. And they engaged in, you know, some of them ritualistic, some of these primitive societies engaged in ritualistic human sacrifice, right? They sacrificed various peoples to the gods. They generally captured other peoples to perform those sacrifices. But you can't kill members of the in-group. Now, as we've gotten more, you know, sort of sophisticated, we have extended those courtesies to others. So, for example, you can't shoot the Canadians, right? We recognize that that would be wrong. Or you can't shoot, you know, the British when they come over here, just because you don't like their funny accent or whatever. So we've extended that prohibition to others. You can't steal from members of the in-group. You couldn't have a society if everybody was stealing. Now, there are societies that are more communal than the United States. I mean, we're a highly capitalistic society. We believe heavily in private ownership of the means of production, land and tangible goods and things. But we have to recognize that property is defined by the sovereign, and that which the sovereign creates, the sovereign can also take away. And who's the sovereign in the United States? Well, it's the people, and we can decide, you know, through elections, what is property. Some of the things that you might think of as being property are not property, and some of the things you might not think of as being property actually are property. So what are some of the things that you might think of as being your property that are not? Your body. You can't sell your body. You can't sell your body parts on the open market. That's creepy. It's not property, right? It's not defined. It's creepy. Can't do that. Some of the things you might not think of as being property actually are things like intellectual property, copyright. These are ideas. You can own them, right? Or at least the expression of them. That's called the idea expression dichotomy. You can own the expression of that through copyright, patent, trademark, those kinds of things. Trade secrets. There are some types of intellectual property that are acknowledged in certain parts called personhood. So your identity may be property in certain places, particularly in the European Union. They have a much higher idea of personhood and your ability to control your own image. So you can't have a society that forms if people can indiscriminately steal from others. And so we find prohibitions in every society against stealing from members of the in-group. Now, again, in more primitive societies, you might be able to steal or raid from members of the out-group, those people over there, but not from members of the in-group. Finally, every society has a prohibition against bearing false witness against members of the in-group. You can't lie about members of you can't accuse somebody falsely of something and get away with it, at least among members of the in-group, right? So we find these prohibitions in all places at all times. And what we find is that there are more and more of these upon which we are finding more and more universal agreement. Almost every nation, at least in theory, has signed on to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Some don't practice it very well, but everyone who's a member of the United Nations, by and large, on the whole, for the most part, has signed on to these ideas. Now, there are places in the world that don't fulfill those dreams. However, the United States is also a work in progress, right? We have not always, if you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we've not always fulfilled those aspirations, right? We've not always fulfilled the aspirations of our own founding documents, like the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Jefferson actually stole that from Locke, who said that we have the right to life, liberty, and property, which we hold dear in this country, right? We love property rights. Everybody, that's part of the American dream. When I used to teach American national government, I would have this assignment called My American Dream. And almost everybody in that class, their American dream was to own a house. That's not necessarily the dream in other countries where land is scarce and the population is big. When I was a foreign exchange student in Germany, most people didn't own their own homes. They lived in apartment buildings and things like that because small country, lots of people, land is scarce. But in the United States, we have what? Lots of land, and we've just kept moving. And so it's part of the American dream to own your own home. That's becoming harder for your generation in many respects, but that's still part of the American dream, I think, is to own a home, to have your own little piece of dirt. And in theory, you own all the way to the center of the earth and all the way to the heavens when you buy that little plot of land. In theory, right? That may have been severed, but we find this. So in all places, all people at all times. So what's the second challenge? The second challenge says, well, okay, maybe it's not up to the individual because obviously we couldn't form societies. We couldn't have marketing. We couldn't be in this building if we just left it up to everybody to decide for themselves what is ethics. There was maybe a time, according to the archaeological and anthropological record, where this state of nature did exist in prehistory. Hobbes imagines this in a book called Leviathan, where he talks about this state of nature. And he says in that state of nature, life is solitary, nasty, brutish, and short. What's the state of nature? How many of you like nature shows? I love nature shows. Right? Like I love the Animal Planet. I love Animal Planet.
Shark Week every
You know?
year.
Yes.
Shark Week, right? Lions, for example. Lions are unique among the feline species in that they're the only felines that naturally live in groups. You want to know, you get two cats, you want to know why they fight constantly. They're not really a social creature for the most part. They're pretty solitary. And most feline species are solitary, except for lions. They live in prides. And it's good to be the male lion in the pride because the lionesses do all the work. Now, the problem with being the male lion of a pride is that eventually, even if you're the strongest, fastest, biggest male, eventually you'll get old and someone will come along and they will take over your pride. They will rob it from you. And when they do, they will destroy all of your young. That's the state of nature. If I'm bigger, stronger, faster, I can control. So Hobbes says we come together and we form societies in order to deal with this problem. And so cultural relativists say it's not in the individual where ethics reside, but rather it's in the society. And again, this seems intuitively attractive. If I ask you really hard questions about things like, for example, with regard to property, there's a case that came out several years ago, very controversial case in the United States, where the Supreme Court said that municipalities, through something called eminent domain, may take people's property. They have to provide them with just compensation, but they may take that property and use it for a public good. And in that case, the thing that they wanted to take the property for was to basically redevelop the area and put it to a higher and better use. And this was very controversial because basically what you're doing is you're taking people's homes and turning it over to a private developer, because what you're saying is this private developer will develop more economic impact than these blighted areas. And isn't that better overall for the community if we can revitalize? We haven't done this through eminent domain, but you see these kinds of things happening even in the Oklahoma City area. When I was a kid growing up in Oklahoma, you would not have gone down to downtown Oklahoma City after 5 o'clock at night. It was a blighted area. And then one person they bought a warehouse down there and they started this restaurant called Spaghetti Warehouse. And you went to that restaurant and they had like a parking lot across the street with chain link and razor wire around the top of it. And people would go to that. And it got to be more and more popular and more people bought these buildings up and started developing them. And then we had a mayor named Ron Norick in Oklahoma City who had this vision of we could turn this area into something more. So they did what was called the first MAPS program, and they developed that area and they built a canal. And if you go down there now, there's all kinds of stuff in that area. What had historically been abandoned buildings full of homeless people and criminal activity has become this really interesting area to go and visit. And I walk along there. We have a longer river walk, by the way, canal, than San Antonio. And it's impressive. And if you walk from the beginning to the end, it ends in this huge statue of the land run. That's enormously impressive. This huge 1 3/4 time actual size figures of the land run, right? So this case says that if the city wants to take your property and turn it over to somebody else, if they give you just compensation, well, that's okay. That's a pretty controversial case, right? Because people like their homes, thought they had their homes, and now the cities can say, well, we're going to take your property, we're going to give you just compensation. Because it's a blighted area, what is just compensation? I had friends in Guthrie who had this problem. They actually owned a business on the west side in Guthrie, and the state decided that because the highway, which is 33, kept getting cut off by floods in Guthrie, it floods quite a bit, they were going to build a new bridge. The bridge that was over the river, the Cottonwood Creek in Guthrie, was built during the WP era, and it was not sufficient. It was A, falling down, and B, it wasn't sufficient to get across the river in case of a flood. So the state highway department decided they were going to build a new bridge that would prevent us from being cut off, and that state highway from being cut off from flooding. And one of my friends actually owned a business in that area called Benton Service Center. And of course, the state says that your land, because it's in a flood plain. Now, they had built their business up, this service center up above the floodplain, above the floodwaters, right? So you went in and you drove up and it was above the floodwaters. And of course, the state says, you're in a floodplain, that property's worth nothing. And their position was, we've built this business and it's gonna cost us $1 million or more to recreate this business somewhere else. You owe us $1 million. And the way the process works is basically the government gets to tell you what your property is worth. And the way it works is that you select an appraiser, the state selects an appraiser, as I understand it, then the two appraisers agree on a third appraiser, and it's almost always what the state wants to pay for your property, is what they think the property's worth, right? This seems inherently unfair, right? But again, property is defined by the sovereign, and that which the sovereign grants, the sovereign can take. So cultural relativism says that it's really based in the culture. And if it's okay in the culture, then that's what we should accept. Now, what's wrong with this? So this is a big issue for businesses because we have something in the United States that prohibits businesses from engaging in a lot of activities that they might want to engage in, particularly as we become more and more. I mean, the days of a country being an island and producing everything that they need are over. We are an interconnected world. And so there are lots of things that are produced in other places that we no longer produce in the United States. We have become actually what I would call a post-industrial society at this point in time. What's the real value in the United States economy? Well, you guys are using it. It's this technology, right? It's intellectual property that's the real value in our economy. We are an information providing economy at this point. We don't produce as many tangible things as we used to in this country. We've outsourced a lot of that. I'd be willing to bet that 99.9% of the stuff you're wearing was not produced in the United States. We used to do that. We used to produce textiles in the US. Where are they produced now? China, India, places like that, where labor is less expensive than it is in the United States. Now, in these places, a lot of times there's corruption, right? And if you want to do business in these places, you have to pay bribes to officials to get your permits through and things like that. And so cultural relativists would say, if that's what the society expects, you just do what the society takes. Now, in the United States, we have something called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which prohibits American businesses from engaging in these kinds of endeavors. And American businesses will argue that that handicaps them in their ability to really engage fully in business in places like China, where it's expected. I actually had a client who faced this. They called me. I had a consulting firm, and one of the companies that I consulted for was a firm here in the Oklahoma City area. And they called and they had a position for an international buyer. And they called and they said, we want to know if we can refuse to hire somebody on the basis of gender for this international buyer. Now, the international buyer requirement was that this person, they were going to go to China and they were going to source products in China. So the requirements for the position were that you had to have an MBA, you had to be fluent in Chinese and in a particular dialect of Chinese, which is the most common. Like everybody, there are various dialects, Mandarin, yeah. There are various dialects in various provinces, but everybody learns Mandarin, I guess, right? You had to be fluent in that. And you had to have like 7 years of experience as a buyer. That was the requirements for the job. The most qualified person was a female, and they didn't want to hire the female. And I said, it was somebody, she was native Chinese, so she obviously spoke the language. She had come to the United States for an education, had an MBA, and she'd worked as a buyer for over 10 years. And I said, why don't you want to hire her? And they said, because in China, it's a traditional society at that point in time, and they will not respect a woman the way, we will not get as good a deal as we would if we sent a man to do this. So we want to hire a man who doesn't, by the way, meet all of the qualifications. He was the next most qualified, but didn't have the number of years of experience. We want to hire him. And can we do that? And I said, no. And they wanted to know why. And I said, because we have this thing called the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that says you can't discriminate in employment on the basis of race, creed, color, gender, right? Which, by the way, gender wasn't originally included. It was a Southern congressman who thought that he could peel off Northern votes if he included women in the bill. He thought he could get it to fail. So gender wasn't initially included in the Civil Rights Act. And my response was, and they said, well, there's something called the BFOQ, right? We know that there's this thing, and can't we argue that this is a BFOQ? And BFOQ stands for bona fide occupational qualification. And I said, no, it's not a BFOQ. And they said, why not? And I said, it's just not. Like, this is a very limited category. What does bona fide occupational qualification mean? Well, you may end up with something that is de facto discriminatory, but it has a connection that is more than tangential to the essential functions of a job. Nothing that you've said is even tangential to the essential functions of the job. What is something that would qualify as a BFOQ? Okay, well, in the United States, we're fascinated by criminal justice. We criminalize a lot of stuff, and we put a lot of people in prison. More than any other Western nation on the planet, we put people in prison. I mean, we're right up there with some real dictatorial regimes in terms of the number of people that we imprison in this country. And we really ought to think about that, in my opinion. So we put a lot of people in prison. Now, states are subject to the Civil Rights Act. The federal government is not. But states are subject. So one of the things that we have to hire for in states like the state of Oklahoma and in counties across the state of Oklahoma are prison guards. If you want to be a prison guard in a male prison facility, there are physical strength requirements that you must meet. So, for example, one of those requirements is that you have to be able to drag a 250-pound dummy across the length of a gym floor. Now, that will have what's called a disparate impact on which group of people, males or females? Females, right? It's going to have you're going to have fewer females that can meet that requirement than males on average. But that is a bona fide occupational qualification. Why? Well, if you are a prison guard in a male prison facility, you may be required to take somebody down and be able to subdue them and contain them in an area that, provides for the restoration of peace, tranquility, and safety of the population as a whole, right? That's a bona fide occupational qualification. What you want is not a bona fide qualified occupation. And the seminal case in this is actually a case out of Southwest that involves Southwest Airlines. Southwest Airlines started as an airline that flew mostly in the state of Texas to serve the oil field industry. Businessmen flying between Dallas and Austin and Houston. That was their original model. And they were the love airline. To this day, if you look at Southwest's logo on their planes and stuff like that, it's a heart. And so they only wanted to hire what at the time were called stewardesses. We no longer call them that, right? We now call them flight attendants. They only wanted to hire females for that role. And they argued that this was a bona fide occupational qualification because they said most of our travelers are businessmen and they will feel just so much more loved if we have females in this role. And the court said, no. That's not a bona fide occupational qualification. Why not? What does a flight attendant do? What is it that they spend most of their time doing?
Kind of like a service, kind of snacks and drinks.
Okay, you can have a duck. Yes, that's what they spend 99% of their time is spent bringing you drinks, asking you if you're in first class, if you need a pillow or a blankie or, whatever. That's what they spend most of their time doing. They're actually required. And why are they required? It's not to bring you a blankie. It's for safety. That's the reason that they're the primary reason. And so the court looks at this and says the primary function of a flight attendant is safety. It's to make sure that first of all, that this briefing is required. You've heard the briefing a million times. Nobody pays attention to the briefing, right? Please fasten your seatbelt. To fasten your seatbelt, insert the metal buckle or insert the flap into the metal buckle. To release, pull up on the handle of the buckle, right? There are 6 emergency exits in our aircraft, 2 forward, 2 aft, and 2 over the wings. In the event of an emergency, lighting along the floor will direct you to the nearest emergency exit. Make sure that you realize that the nearest emergency exit may be behind you. That's what the court says is the primary function. And so they said, no, you have to hire men for this role as well. Right? It's not a bona fide occupational qualification. Now, what can we say about cultural relatives? So cultural relatives would say, look, if that's the way business is done in China, you just have to put up with that. And that's their, just go with the flow. Well, in theory then, if slavery were legal, and there are places in which slavery is still existing, the chocolate in your chocolate bars may be made with slave labor. CNN did this whole thing. E-Democracy. Find the website. CNN did this whole special on how to tell whether or not your chocolate is ethically sourced. You can look for Utz Good Inside and Rainforest Alliance, basically. A lot of the chocolate in the country, in the world, is actually produced by what amounts to slave labor. And if you accepted cultural relativism as true, if you said that's just the way they do it in the Ivory Coast, most of us say that's creepy. Like, you shouldn't do that. And of course, a lot of these countries point to that use child labor and use slave labor. They point to the United States and they say, you used to do that. That's part of development. That's not a valid defense to it, right? And most of us would say it's creepy. Again, what we find is that if we look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, almost everybody agrees to this in principle. The fact that it's not occurring in practice is irrelevant. As Socrates points out in Republic, which I'll talk about in a minute, you don't need a philosopher to tell you what the best is, or to tell you what's actually going on in the world, I'm sorry. You need the philosopher to tell you what the best in you can be, not what's actually occurring in the world. The third challenge to philosophical ethics is called psychological egoism. These two seem intuitively appealing. This one doesn't, but it's actually the harder one to deal with. Psychological egoism is what we call a deterministic philosophy. It says that either as a result of nature, nurture, or a combination of the two, we can't really help but react in the way that we react. We think that we have free will, but it's illusory. And there's a guy, a marketing guy, who writes a book about this, who kind of uses this argument, and I think I've mentioned this book before. His name is Martin Lindstrom, and his book is called Biology, Biology. And what he argues in biology is that we can predict with great accuracy whether or not somebody likes a product. Whether or not they say they like it is irrelevant. If we put them in fMRI machines and look at their brainwave activity, we can tell whether or not the pleasure part of the brain is functioning when we use certain marketing appeals to them, right? And so psychological egos say we really don't have free will. You think you have free will, but you don't. Now, in years past, I've done an experiment in the class, but because I'm sort of short on time, I'll abbreviate it. I used to ask this question: what's the difference between males and females genetically? The people over in biology would probably be horrified at my overly simplified explanation, but it's a chromosome. Basically, makes you either male or female. Right? And so I'd say everyone who has a Y chromosome, raise your hand. Everybody in the classroom would raise their hand. Why did everybody raise their hand? Well, because we're programmed to do things like respond to what your instructor says. Do what you're told, right? And they would use this, psychological egos would use this as an example of you don't really have free will. Now, if you think about it, you think you have free will, but can you will yourself to not want something? Can you will yourself to not want the things that you want? It's really, really hard if you think about it.
It depends on what it is.
I don't know that you can will yourself to not want something. And for a psychological egoist, what they would say is that if you say, look, I'm not going to buy X because I really, really want it, but I want my money more. We're coming up this week, the State Fair of Oklahoma starts. It is a fascinating experiment in marketing to see what people would rather have than their own money. Walk around the fair and see what the crap people will buy that they would rather have. I mean, like, that they would rather have than their own money. It's fascinating to me.
I'll empty my wallet on the cinnamon rolls.
Oh, absolutely. Like, you watch them being made and you can just feel your arteries seizing up. You know, as they take sticks of butter and they slice with these huge slicers, these sticks of butter, and then they roll out this dough and they put these sticks of butter all over the dough. And then they pour sugar and cinnamon all over it. And then they put some more butter on it. And then they roll it up and most of the people in that line don't need that. I don't need that. Right? But I'm gonna have one.
Yeah.
Right? And I'm gonna have, I mean, I go to the fair every day, love it. It's absolutely my favorite activity in the fall. The poncho dogs are the best corn dogs. Like, love corn dogs, love poncho dogs. If you go to the fair, the poncho dogs are they're the best ones. They have poncho dogs all over the place. It's fantastic. Right? Not big on the turkey leg, but you know, I see lots of people walking around with the turkey legs. Not sure what that is. Just like a big greasy. Yeah. It's amazing what people would rather have than their own money. But you decide you're not going to have the cinnamon roll because they're something like, I don't know, like $12 now for a cinnamon roll. Right there, and that's just crazy expensive for a cinnamon roll. But you want your money more, but you didn't will yourself to want that either, right? You may not have the cinnamon roll, but it's because you want something more than the cinnamon roll. Now, what can we say about psychological egoism? Why is this problematic? Well, first of all, anytime you start saying people always do something, They will always act selfishly, for example, according to psychological egoists. It's problematic. We see that people do act altruistically all the time. Now, for the psychological egoists, they would just come back with, well, that makes you feel good about yourself. Mother Teresa was not really a saint. She just was doing it so she would feel better about herself. It also doesn't tell us what to do when people are enormously conflicted about the choices that they have to make. All of us have faced choices in our lives where we have to choose between the lesser of two evils. Many of us feel that way about the upcoming election, right? There's not a great choice. You know, we're gonna go into the voting booth. This is what we have, right?
Can I just write you in?
Right, yeah, okay, no. I don't think it'll work, right? I mean, you've got two choices here, you're gonna have to select one. It doesn't tell us what to do when we're enormously conflicted. And finally, the problem with deterministic theory is that we do find that people do engage in rational analysis of alternatives and make really positive choices. Not all the time. It depends. And a lot of it depends on the level of risk factor that somebody engages in. Sure, a lot of decisions are just sort of automatic. You know, I'm hungry, I go to the cabinet and I grab the first thing I see because, you know, it's the easiest thing to get to, or the McDonald's is the easiest. But when it comes to tougher choices, we do see an evaluation of alternatives, right? So what is a valid ethical theory? Well, the first valid ethical theory that uses philosophy, that doesn't use either mythology or religion, probably started in ancient Greece. So what is philosophy? It's a rational analysis of alternatives. Did the Greeks invent it? Probably. Why did they invent it? I think the answer to that question, there's lots of people that have come up with answers to the question of why did the Greeks invent philosophy, and I've enjoyed listening to some of these, you know, at various kinds of academic lectures or various classes that I've taken over the years in philosophy. One theory goes, the Greeks invented philosophy because, well, you know, they had slave labor, so they had all this free time on their hands to just sit around and think lofty thoughts. There have been societies far more devoted to slave labor than the Greeks. In fact, the Greeks were very sensitive to the economic impact that slave labor had on their economy. If you had too many slaves, it really impacted the ability of your own people to work and earn a living. And so there have been societies that have been far more impacted by slavery than the Greeks, and no evidence. The American South, for example, far more impacted by slave labor than the ancient Greeks. No shred of philosophy there coming out of the South, or not much. Another theory, you know, the ecological theory. They have sunshine. The Greek Isles are just full of sunshine, and doesn't that, you know, like, you've got all this sunshine and slave labor, and isn't that a great thing for, you know, really? The sun shines in most places in the world. Yeah.
Can you explain to me what rational analysis is one more time?
Rational analysis. It is an evaluation of known alternatives based on the best outcome.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
More sunshine than ancient Egypt? No philosophy coming out of ancient Egypt. I think the reason that, and Daniel Robinson talks about this in his lectures, the reason that I think the Greeks came up with philosophy, the reason that they invented philosophy, is that their mythology, which they considered religion, wasn't very satisfying in terms of answering these questions of knowledge, conduct, and governance. You didn't upset the gods, you gave homage to the gods, but these were messy characters. How did Zeus become, so in this show, Zeus is the king of the gods, played by Jeff Goldblum. You know, his wife is Hera. Like, these are really, really unsavory characters. Zeus's wife is also his sister. And he became king of the gods by killing his father. Ooh. Creepy.
His father did eat him and all of his siblings though, so he kind of had it coming.
Well, yes, that's true. You know, so the older gods are destroyed by I mean, like, these are not people that you're turning to for the ultimate meaning of life. And because of that, I think, and Daniel Robinson argues that this is the reason that Greeks invented philosophy, was because they didn't have a satisfactory religion that answered this question for them. So the first, I mean, there are echoes of philosophical thought in other places and other times, but the first fully worked out system that we know of that's saved to history is Plato's dialogues of Socrates. So we have three great thinkers in ancient Greece that have had profound impact, even though students to this day ask me, what do these guys who could never have imagined microwave ovens and cell phones and self-driving cars? My sister-in-law just bought a Tesla X, and it's amazing. The car will drive itself. Like, you put that on, you put in an address and an autopilot, and it just goes. Now, you do have to kind of keep your hands on the steering wheel every once in a while, otherwise it turns itself off. But I've done this, like, I mean, you plug in it, I'm just like, I'm fascinated by how it does this. Comes to a stop, you know, before it runs into the car in front of it. I mean, it's really remarkable. These people could never have imagined that, right? So what impact did they have on today's world and today's marketing? Turns out quite a bit, right? In Republic, what we find, which is the first fully worked out system of philosophy that answers all three of these questions, the question of knowledge, conduct, and governance, we find the basis for communism, for example, which had a profound impact on our reaction to that economic system. And one of the reasons that we are so highly capitalistic in the United States, because after World War II, we fought what was called a Cold War against the Soviets and this idea of communism. You can find the foundations of philosophical communism in Republic. It answers this question of knowledge. What is it we can know? Well, Socrates in that says that we are oftentimes deceived in what we can know. And in fact, we are. Our senses oftentimes deceive us into believing things that are not true. I told you all, I have an airport board meeting today. So I'm the chairman of the Guthrie Edmond Regional Airport, wearing my airport swag today. Last time I was wearing my city swag. Before that, I was wearing my UCO swag, right? So I'm wearing my airport board. You all have flown on an airplane, right? When you experience turbulence, what's the sensation?
Like hitting a bump on the road.
Okay, it's oftentimes the sensation is that you're falling. And in many instances, you're not falling, you're being pushed up, particularly by low-level radiation turbulence, which is caused by uneven heating of the Earth's surface, right? You're actually being thrown up. The sensation is that you're falling. In many instances, your senses can deceive you. So in Republic, the question of knowledge is answered by Socrates in that he says there are people for whom they can see things clearly, and this is the philosopher. And we should follow these people, right? He answers the question of conduct in that he comes up with a whole system of governance. That's why it's called Republic, because it's a whole system of governance. What he says is, look, if we can figure out what's good for the society as a whole, we can apply that to the individual, and we can come up with what's good conduct. The society as a whole is basically a big picture of the individual. And we come up with a system of governance, which is a Republican form of governance, which is the kind of government that we have to this day. Now, modern political scientists modern political scientists define republic as, or republicanism, small r republicanism, as representative democracy. That's not what the ancient Greeks meant. It's certainly not what our founding fathers thought. A republican form of government, according to the ancients, and as used by the Romans who picked it up from the Greeks, is what we can find in Machiavelli's discourses on the first 12 books of Titus Livy, which is, a reflection of the Roman Republic. So republicanism is elements of monarchy, elements of aristocracy, and elements of polity, which is what the Greeks called good participation by mass numbers of people. So in the Roman Republic, for example, you had the consuls who acted as the element of monarchy. There were two of them. You had the aristocracy in the form of the Roman Senate, and then you had some form of popular representation in the tribunes that were elected by the people as a whole. So it's these elements of these things. And that's what we see in Republic. We get all three of these topics covered in Republic. It's the first fully worked out system. There may have been others before Socrates came along, but they're lost probably to history. So as far as we know, the Greeks probably did invent philosophy, distinct from and separate from some religion. And the first work of it we see fully worked out is Republic. When we talk about the dialogues, the Socratic dialogues, we can classify things as early, middle, and late. And what we find is that some of the ideas that are very worked out, well worked out in the first dialogues are ultimately jettisoned in the later dialogues. But we find these elements, and to this day, we have influences in the United States. We have an imperial presidency, right? The president is not directly elected by the people. How is the president of the United States elected, for example?
Electoral college.
That's right, you can have a duck. It's all, these elected by the Electoral College. Electors are chosen by the parties, right? And so it's a winner-take-all system in most states, which is why it is possible to win the Electoral College and lose the popular vote, which has happened 4 times in our history. Most recently, Donald Trump won the Electoral College over Hillary Clinton, who beat him by about 4 million votes, right, in the popular vote. We have elements of aristocracy in both the United States Senate, which is not popularly elected. It represents states, not people. And the United States Supreme Court, the only branch of government that is really, truly popularly elected, is 1/2 of the Congress, which is the United States House of Representatives, in which everyone sort of has an equal voice in that they are roughly apportioned equally among the 400, by population, the 435 members of the United States House of Representatives, right? Just as Socrates had a very famous student, we only know about Socrates from 2 sources. One, his student Plato, who says he wrote everything that Socrates said down. I don't think we should take him at his word at that. And the second was the poet Xenophon. Just as Socrates had a student that was very famous, called Plato. Plato had a student that was very famous named Aristotle, and Aristotle answers these questions a little differently than Plato and Socrates do in Republic, in that he finds a different way. He doesn't say, so in Republic, Socrates comes up with what he thinks is the best form of government for all people at all places at all times, and it's a republic. Again, it has these 3 elements to it. Aristotle doesn't view things that way, and I think we can learn an enormous amount from Aristotle that is very relevant to marketing today, right? Highly, highly relevant to marketing today. What we can take away from Socrates and Plato is that with regard to ethics, we should be able to see these things in the mind's eye, which is where the philosopher king comes in. So it's the use of and discerning ethical principles a priori rather than a posteriori, which means using the rational mind as opposed to a posteriori, which is knowledge that's gained through experience. But I think Aristotle is much more practical, and his philosophy is, and so I do dote on Aristotle, he is my favorite, more practical and useful today in terms of marketing and its practical applications. So Aristotle was by nature. So if we look at Republic, what we have is a thought experiment. It is logical. And so I asked this question in classes. Is everything that we teach on a college campus either an art or a science? Or is there some third category? So what's a science? Is marketing an art or a science? Your answer is you can have a duck. Why do you say it's both?
Well, it's because there are elements that deal with calculation
Okay,
and others that are dealt with more of a sense of, you kind of have to, you watch, I guess you could say, certain things that go on, and then you have to adapt and artistically
Okay.
change your
all right.
course of action.
Ad execution is largely a art, right? I mean, coming up with storyboards and a message and things like that's a very creative process. And there are lots of ads that are very creative that may not be effective, right? And so that's art. One of my favorites is the Herding Cats commercial. Have we watched that? Have I shown that ad to you? So this is like a very creative ad. I think it didn't actually, nobody remembered the business after it played.
I love that.
That's a very creative ad.
It's very fun to film.
It's what?
It looked very fun to make.
Yeah, I'm, very creative. It engages the mind of the consumer, fails because it didn't deliver a selling message. But it was creative, right? That's subjective. So that's art. Marketing is also a science. We can figure out scientifically what people want by doing scientific research, studying them, asking them in surveys, what they like or dislike about things, looking at content analysis, right? So Republic is this thought experiment, which is logical, but it's not scientific. Aristotle was trained as a physician and a biologist, and so he thinks of things as more scientific. And so what we see in Aristotle, I think, is highly useful to marketers today. What do we see if we look at Aristotle's great works overall? So Aristotle's great works are things like Aristotle's The Politics, Aristotle's treatise on governance, in which he says there's not one type of governance. So in Republic, we come up with this idea that the best form of governance is a republic, elements of monarchy, aristocracy, polity. Aristotle says, well, that may not work in all places at all times. He studies 350 Greek polis, which were city-states, which is what they had. And he said, look, there are good governments and there are bad governments. And he defines a good government as one that functions in the interest of the governed, a bad government as one that functions in the interest of the governed rather than the interest of the citizens, right? And there are various types. There are good governments of one, good governments of a few, and good governments of many. A good government of one he calls a monarchy. A bad government of one he calls a tyranny. A good government of a few he calls an aristocracy. A bad government of a few he calls an oligarchy. So again, these are ones that function in the interest of the governed. A good government of many, he calls a polity. That's what the Greeks called it. And the worst form of government of all, democracy. Democracy is mob rule. Now, of these types of governance, he says there's nothing wrong with any of them. You might, it just depends on the people. For example, one of the things as Americans that we think, first of all, we think we have a democracy. I don't really think we have a democracy, right? We have a republic, but we have a tendency to think we are a democracy, and we try to export it. We've tried to export it to lots of places. The British tried to do this too, in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. And they set up, when they left, they set up constitutions that had these things, and they lasted for one cycle. And then they rapidly devolved into something other than a democracy. Why is that? Democracy requires certain things and educational levels that may not exist in various places. And there's lots of theories of development, and this is not a political science course. The part that I'm going to focus on is what can we learn as marketers from this. So Aristotle says he really likes aristocracy. Why? In a monarchy, it's very easy for one person to go from being sort of an enlightened despot to being tyrannical. We find that, for example, in English and Anglo-American history with Henry VIII. Henry VIII started out as a very sort of enlightened despot king who was very influenced by the humanist movement. And he rapidly degenerated into a tyrant, right? In a democracy, it's very easy, or in a polity, it's very easy for the mob to take over and trample on the will of the minority. Or even to have a minority that tramples on the will of the majority. Because if you have people that are motivated enough and are led by a demagogue, this can happen. In an aristocracy, you have enough people that it's less likely. It can still degenerate into an oligarchy, but this is definitely Aristotle's sort of favorite form. Now, why is that? It's the middle ground. What we see in all of Aristotle's writings is this balance, the idea of the golden mean. And as marketers, I think we can really pick up on this because in his treatise on friendship, Aristotle says, for example, there are 3 types of friendship, and we should take advantage of this. When I teach sales, I talk about this because we want our customers to have a relationship with us. There is an old adage that says you should never mix business with pleasure. But the honest to God truth is people want to do business with people that they like. So you have to recognize what kind of friendship you're talking about. Aristotle says there are 3 types of friendship. There is friendship that's grounded on utility. Right? What are friendships that are grounded on utility? Almost everybody in here, because you're business students, you're not lazy liberal arts students. Like, if you go to the land of the hippy dippy over there, you have lots of people sitting around in the lotus position doing nothing. You all have jobs, right? All of you probably had a job. You've made friends at your job. Why? Because they're necessary. You have to rely on other people to help you perform your job. Most jobs require other people. And so you need them. And when you left that job, did you stay friends with them? Well, maybe some, but the vast majority of them, you probably didn't stay friends with. You got new friends when you got a new job. Why? Because now you need these people. Nothing wrong with that. Just recognize that there's a transitory nature of the friendship that's grounded on utility. In sales, this is what we're going to find, is that we will be friends with our clients as long as we provide a useful benefit to them, and as long as the relationship maintains a usefulness. At the other end of the spectrum, you have friendship that's grounded in pleasure. I jokingly say these are your drinking buddies. And when you have to go to whiskey school, that's my euphemism for AA or rehab. They're going to tell you have to change your playmates and your playgrounds. Right? The pleasure will end, and the friendship will end. Then in the middle is perfected friendship. These are the friendships of a lifetime. This is the ideal form. They're the ones that you can count on one hand. They're the people that will really, really be there for you when you're down and out, that will help you, right? Very few of these. Mostly what we can learn from Aristotle as marketers is that we need to figure out what the utility is in our relationships. We build relationships with our clients and customers, and we have to figure out the utility. And how do we maintain that utility? But everything for Aristotle is a balance and a proportionality. It's the golden mean. And I think we can recognize a lot of that. One of the things that we talk a lot about in marketing to our internal constituents, so it's marketing is the only fully integrated function of the firm. And what that means is that marketers seek to add value across all aspects of the firm. And I gave you examples of how you can start a business and not know anything about accounting, not know anything about finance, not know anything about management. You don't have to, management fundamentally is about getting other people to do. I can open a law, and I have a law practice, right? That's largely, I had a partner, he passed away recently, but it's largely me now. My law practice is largely me. I don't manage anybody in that law practice. I don't have a secretary or a receptionist because I don't need one anymore. Those days are over. And so I'm not really managing. You don't have to know anything about management if you're just doing yourself. There are people who say you can manage yourself or you can manage time. You can't, right? We talk about it. You can't really manage time. Like time is like, I am running out of time in this class right now. Managing it would be like, oh, I'm gonna extend the time, or I could make minutes last. You can't do that, right? Management is fundamentally about driving other people, but you can't do it without marketing. And so one of the things that we do recognize is that when you have a business, it's important to market not just to your customers, but it's also important to market to your internal constituents, your employees, to get them to live the brand. To get them to live the brand. And how do we do that? Well, it's by respecting them as, treating them as something more than just a cog in a machine. And I think those are the kinds of things. So even though Aristotle couldn't have imagined a world in which we could travel by airplane and, cars that will self-drive, I think his fundamental focus on these things that are sort of innately human help us. Again, we talk about now in the modern world, we talk about work-life balance, recognizing that this is important. That's a very Aristotelian concept. That you don't just live to work. And that we need to recognize that employees need to have these sort of psychological goods as well as just, as well, and in addition to their salaries, right? And the tangible benefits that you can touch. We'll talk about modern ethical theory next time. And then we will move into talking about substantive examples within both internal and external constituencies in marketing. So if you got ducks, come see me, and I'll give you your points for today. Stop the video, the live stream.